The war had ended 1,000 years ago. Yet somehow, humanity still carried its scars among the stars. On the nights when the academy domes of Terran Alexandria went quiet, the glass would hum with the wind and the students would hear it, that far, thin vibration like a kettle on the verge of boil, and know the future was being forged somewhere they could not yet see. Eli Calder sat on the back bench of Orbital Hall 7, hands knotted on a plain field notebook, listening. He always listened. Others filled the space with their voices, their rumors, the glitter of their ambition. Eli let the sound pass through him like current through a wire and wrote nothing in his book. The teachers called him reserved. The cadets called him ghost. He didn't mind either name. He had grown up in a city that could only afford to whisper. Across from him, Threx of the Takara flexed his scaled forearms in the full shine of the hall lights. His face angled so the bone spurs along his jaw caught the reflections of the academy banners. Threx had an audience wherever he stood. He carried victories the way other people carried backpacks. To his right lounged Lessa, the Alkari scout with 2 nodules of silver in her left ear and eyes like hot metal catching a spark. She could track dust across vacuum. She looked bored, which meant she was ready. Vanna, webbed-fingered and gentle, wound new med tape onto her kit. Auric preened his crimson feathers with the careful dignity of old soldiers. Joro, the Venter automaton, powered down into a restful alert, the glow of his optics dim as evening under snow. The hall went dark. Commander Rahl, tall, chitinous mandibles polished to a ceremonial sheen, appeared on the dais. "Cadets," he said, the clicks of his native language softened by the translator. "Today the Deathworld evaluation commences. You will be deployed to Vir 3. Atmospheric variance, severe. Biota, hostile. Geology, unstable. Cycle length, 37 days. Team survival confers graduation. Lone survival confers legend." Laughter rippled, the kind that covers fear. "Your pods are prepped." Rahl's compound eyes glinted. "You launch at dawn." When the lights rose, chairs scraped, boots thudded, promises were made by young mouths to deaf stars. Eli's team gathered without ceremony. He hovered on the edge of the circle. Threx tilted his head toward him with a half-smile that was all teeth. "Softworld," the Takara said, savoring the word. "You've seen a predator, a real one." Eli looked at the scales, the smile, the easy contempt. He thought of dogs on old Earth, of the storm that had stripped half his neighborhood to ribs and wire while the other half fed them and rebuilt. He thought of how quiet was a blade if you knew how to hold it. "I have," Eli said. "What did you do?" Lessa asked, curious. "Not unkind." "Learned when to run," Eli replied, "and when to teach it to run from me." Threx laughed. "We'll see." They met the dawn on the drop deck. Streaks of rose smeared the sky over the Atlantic curve. Shuttles chuckled as crews fed them fuel. Eli checked his suit seals, listened to his own breath, heard the slow, low rhythm of his blood and the cold, seamed sound of the ocean striking the base pylons miles below. He wrote a single line in his book, "You're not here to be seen." Then he closed it and stepped into the pod. Descent turned the world to fire. Brutal gravity pressed him into the harness. The pod shook. Plasma raked the friction shield until the whole capsule sang like a struck bell. At 6,000 meters, the clouds parted, violet as an old bruise, and Vir 3 revealed itself in a sudden, feverish panorama. Black mountains like teeth. Rivers that shone a poisonous mint. Sheets of rippling dust like things alive. They hit like hammers. The harness snapped free. Joro was already sealing his hatch with resin. Lessa plunged her arm through the smoke to drag Vanna from a tangle of struts. Eli swept the pod once, twice. The checklist flickered across his forearm display, and then the world under his feet flexed. "Out," he said. The ground broke like crust atop a boiling pot. Glass-skinned serpents erupted, mouths rimmed with hardened mineral, bodies lit with chemical light. Vanna screamed, Threx fired, Auric leapt, wings half spread, impossible in this gravity, and Joro placed himself like a wall between them and the fissure. Eli saw the serpents recoil from a plume of steam that coughed from a vent near the shattered pod hull. Heat. He reached barehanded into the pod nose, yanked a length of glowing conduit and jammed it into the nearest crack. The serpents hissed, their glass teeth went white hot, and they fled back underground. Heat, Eli said. They won't cross it. Good ears, Lessa panted. Good eyes, Eli corrected. Ears say run, eyes say how. They moved. They moved like prey that knew it would have to become predator or die as practice. Joro loomed behind, hissing coolant across his armor as acid rain spat from a bruised sky. By the time they reached a jagged ridge, the rain had sharpened into needles that punched tiny smoking pinholes in anything they struck. Lessa found a cave. Oric wedged his shoulders and forced the stone wider with a breath that was almost a prayer. Vanna slid inside and snapped filters across the opening. Eli dumped the pod's emergency spool of flex foil and sealed the gaps with a slurry of powdered basalt and glue. The rain chittered against their ad hoc shelter like an old, angry radio. No one spoke for a while. The sound of their breathing braided with the storm. When the worst had passed, Threx lifted his chin. "We move east," he said, as if he had always been in charge. "Beacon extraction at 42 clicks. We ration, we rotate watch, and we stop for nothing that isn't oxygen. Beacon's a rumor till we put hands on it," Lessa murmured. "Then we make it truth," Threx snapped. Eli tested his filters, tested the seal, tested the feel of the cave floor with his palm, reading it. He looked like a man listening to wood dry. "Anything to add?" Threx said lazily. "Don't stand near the walls," Eli replied. "Why?" The rock pulsed under their feet. Something enormous moved far beneath. The cave sighed, a long, low flexing that set Eli's teeth on edge, and a fine burst of dust fell from the ceiling in a slow, shimmering curtain. It hung like breath in cold air and drifted straight toward the opening, pulled by a draft. "Because the walls are the lungs," Eli said, "and we're in the mouth." They slept in shifts and did not sleep at all. Dawn arrived mean and thin. They ate ration bars until their tongues went numb and set out across a landscape that wanted to unmake them. The gravity stuck like a tight shirt. Their suits squeaked where acid had chewed. Lessa trotted ahead with a hunter's economy. Oric stooped sometimes to touch the ground, his expression that of a veteran asking a battlefield for permission to live. Around noon equivalent, the sun broke through like a coin crawling up out of oil. They crossed a plain of pale glass mushrooms taller than spires. The whole field turned its translucent heads to follow them. When Threx skewered one with a spear of scavenged strut, the others hummed a note like the underside of thunder. Vanna pressed her hands to the sides of her helmet. "Don't hurt them," she murmured. "They're singing to something bigger." "Then we keep our weapons quiet," Eli said. "Noise calls teeth." He told them stories when the wind grew strange and their minds slid toward panic. He spoke of his grandmother's 7th-floor apartment with the leaky radiator that thumped arrhythmically all winter long, of making soup with whatever they had, of stealing bolts from the rail line to trade for peppers in summer. He'd learned to live in precarity's tight circle. A planet like Vyre 3 felt almost honest. It tried to kill you boldly. On the 4th day, a sheet of moving sand rose on the horizon. It looked like surf rolling across desert. It looked beautiful until it hit the first black rock and ate it down to shadow. "Creeping erosion swarm," Joro intoned, voice dulled by static. "Silicate devourers, probability of survival at direct contact, minimal." "Get high," Eli said, "now." They ran for a basalt knuckle jutting from the plain like a knife point. Lessa went up like smoke. Threx hauled Vanna. Oric, heavy in this heavy air, tossed his rifle up first and hauled himself hand over hand with a grimace that crinkled the skin around his eyes. Eli took the rear. The sand reached the rock and began to climb by eating the handholds. He looked into it and saw millions of mouth parts working in silent, tireless hunger. He threw the coil of flex foil down and smoothed it over a face of stone. The swarm slurped across it and paused, confused by the sudden slickness. He grabbed Threx's forearm and let the bigger alien's mass yank him up onto the ledge. The swarm surged, frustrated. It made no sound, which was worse than any sound. They waited until it passed like a low tide and left the rock pitted, the ground behind them newly flat as bone. "You do not squeal, soft world," Threx panted. "You move." "Noise is a tax," Eli said, and let the tremor in his arms work itself out in silence. Nights grew longer. The planet changed moods with the laziness of a cat and the cruelty of a storm. They climbed a canyon of blown-out glass and slept in a nook where the wind couldn't find them. They woke to a sky full of torn veils and a smell that was like rain trapped in a cave with old bones. Vanna's hands shook. She held them flat against her thighs until they stilled. "What do you think about," she asked quietly, "when you walk?" "Feet," Eli said. He looked at her and let the smallest smile reach his eyes. "And the way my mother's balcony sounded at midnight. And the first time I jumped from the seawall because my cousins dared me, and how the water was so cold it taught my heart a new beat." "That's a lot," Auric murmured. "I make the road inside my head bigger than the one under my boots," Eli replied. "It helps when the ground tries to eat you." On the 12th day they found them, another team, half buried near a cluster of black obelisks that hummed if you breathed on them. Their armor had been dissolved in layers like leaves in autumn rain. Names blurred, faces gone. Vanna knelt and covered a pair of skeletal hands with the soft gray sand and said a word in her language that tasted like the inside of a shell. Eli stood a little ways away and looked east. The obelisks made his teeth hurt. He whispered, "We see you." Threx watched him. The Takara's tail twitched in thought. "You make little speeches, soft world," he said at last, not mocking. "I learned to say grace," Eli said, "for food, for the fact that we had any." They moved on. Food ran low. Auric's feathers dulled until they looked like worn felt. Lessa's steps lost their bounce. Joro's knee servos grew erratic. He paused often and retuned with little glowing tools that burned Eli's nostrils when he smelled them. When the rain returned, it wasn't liquid. It was a fall of hair-thin wires, metallic filaments that tangled around anything they touched and tightened. One wrapped Eli's wrist. It bit and kept biting, cinching tight hour by hour. He sat with it and breathed and refused to pull because his grandmother had taught him that some knots cinch when you fight and slacken when you wait. He warmed the wire with his breath, with his palms, with the faint heat of the filter exhaust, and after 2 hours it loosened enough for Vanna to snip it with a surgical cutter. He cradled the wound like a secret for a while. On the 18th day they entered the canyon. The walls were dark, shot through with veins of iridescent stone, and they pulsed with a slow rhythm like something sleeping. They walked softly. The dark gathered in the hollows like animals. Lessa's ears lay flat. Auric's eyes turned glassy and wide. Then the world below them inhaled. The floor opened. A hunger older than ships and cities rose from the depths. It was not one thing, it was many, a choir of tendrils and plates and eyes that shone like dimes sunk in tar. Joro stepped forward, a shield, and the thing struck. It carved a trench where he had been standing and left edges that smoked. Joro turned his optics to Eli. "Priority, organics," he said, crisp and gentle at once. "Contingency, self-sacrifice acceptable." "No," Vanna said, the words so full of salt it hurt. Joro placed a hand on her shoulder. "You taught me to measure pain not merely as loss but as proof that a thing mattered," he said. "I will not waste that lesson." Eli looked at the canyon mouth, at the arch of black stone, at the shape of the thing and the way its shadows bent when it moved. He knew he could not save Joro from what Joro had already decided to become. "Make it count," Eli said. Joro ran. He ran with the heavy, sudden grace of a machine that had decided to use itself like a thrown weapon. The creature followed, drawn to the heat and the steady pulse of his core. Joro paused at the lip of the canyon's bend, turned once and exploded. The light was clean. It was the cleanest thing they had seen in days. It left a scar on Eli's vision that looked like a doorway. They crawled out on their bellies while the world stitched itself around the wound Joro had made. Auric cried without sound. Lessa put her hand on the rock and thanked it for not letting her slip. Threx's breathing came ragged and soft. Eli sat with his back to a shard of glass and let his body shake. When it was done, he stood and said, "We move." On the 22nd day they reached a plateau. A broken tower lay there, tangled with cables like dried vines, and at its base, the beacon cradle. It was melted. The main unit was gone. The backup was a hunk of slag. Threx sank to his knees and laughed once, a bark like a cough. "All this way," he said. "All this way for a hole." "Not a hole," Eli murmured. He dug. He dug the way you dig when your hands have memorized the weight of a shovel and the feel of dry soil turning under steel. The planet fought back, offering up razor chips that sliced his fingertips through the gloves. He bled and let the blood be. Vanna reached for him and he shook his head once. She folded her hands back into her lap like a patient who knows the medicine must go to someone else. At last his fingers closed on a cylinder deep under fused rock. He eased it free. A heartbeat pulsed through it, slow, sickly, but proud. He slapped a patch of flex foil over a cracked port and looked at Auric. "You have the cleanest hands," Eli said. "Honor guard's job. Hold this like it's the last egg of your line." Auric cradled it. His huge fingers were delicacy itself. "What now?" "Now we coax it awake," Eli said. They did together. Vanna stitched a bypass with hair-thin sutures. Lessa scavenged a power cell from a dead drone and kissed its casing for luck. Threx broke the last of his rations in half and put one piece on the ground the way his people fed their gods when they wanted the desert to spare a caravan. Eli sat cross-legged and spoke to the machine in a human tongue made of patience and stubbornness. He had coaxed radiators to heat and engines to turn in the dark of winter. He had persuaded a feral air purifier to keep breathing in a blackout. He knew this conversation. The beacon flickered. It coughed. It sent a single ping that went up through the red sky like a fly climbing a window. "That a rescue call?" Threx asked. "That's a pulse that says I am," Eli said. "It's the first thing." "The second, where are you?" Eli said. "It'll remember help soon. It's a little like us." The planet answered at dusk. The ground under the plateau rose the way a patient sits up. The canyon thing's shadow lay across the ridge, and then the body that cast it loomed overhead, no mouth, because mouths are for animals, but a field of graspers and eyes and a skin that rearranged itself in patterns that made Eli's pulse stumble. It learned, Lessa whispered. It followed. "The beacon's heat," Vanna said, horrified. "Or Joro's light burned its name into us," Auric murmured. "War has a long memory." The creature did not charge. It placed a limb on the ground and the ground sagged. It tasted the air. Heat made it shiver. Eli's mind worked. He saw the open core in the beacon's midsection, the hairline crack, the way the energy surged and then dropped like a heartbeat faltering. "We can't fight that," Threx said, voice flat. "No," Eli agreed, "but we can teach it a lesson it will never forget." He moved without argument and without invitation. Hold the core. Vanna grabbed his wrist. "You'll die," she said. Her eyes were full of clean water. "Eli, maybe," he said. "Maybe not, but if I do, there's meat on my bones. Take it only if you have to. Try the mushrooms first." "That is not a joke," Threx growled and sounded insulted by grief. "It isn't," Eli said quietly. "It's logistics." He overrode the safety with his thumb. The core began to hum. The light inside it shook like a fever. The creature felt it. It turned all its eyes to him, a galaxy of desire, of hunger, of some dim comprehension that something here could interrupt the order of its long, patient days. "Get them away," Eli said to Threx. Threx stared, uncomprehending. He had been raised on sagas. The heroes in those stories died shouting their names at the sky. Eli offered him no name. He offered him a task. "Get them away," he repeated. "Be the wall for once, not the spear." Threx moved. He grabbed Vanna by the harness and shoved. Auric lifted Lessa and went into that lumbering, tender gait of his that could outpace a storm on a good day. Vanna looked back once. Eli was walking. He looked like a man going home across a winter street. The creature moved. It dropped limbs like battering rams. The ground leapt in waves. Eli staggered once and kept going. He held the core like a lantern that showed him the future in burning frames. He reached the thing and threw the core like a boy skipping a stone on a lake. It struck the shimmering skin and stuck. It sank an inch. The hum became a howl. Eli ran. The blast cleared the clouds. Later, Lessa would say the sky went white and then black and then clean. The plateau split like a book falling open. The creature rolled and fell and collapsed. The air turned sweet for one count of 3. Threx threw himself over Vanna. Auric tried to grow larger than his shape and nearly succeeded. When the light died, the creature was in pieces the size of harvest barns and the beacon was a shattered laugh. There was nothing of Eli where he had been. Lessa found a length of melted strap and touched it to her forehead. Threx made a sound from low in his chest and punched the ground until his knuckles bled in thin, smoking lines. They stayed 2 days. The storm cycles were off. The plateau had a new shape. Vanna walked to the edge each dawn and looked down into a crack that went on, as if the planet had decided to add a new letter to its alphabet. On the 3rd day, a shuttle carved a path through the top cloud layer with a sound like a hand clapping over the mouth of a screaming kettle. It dropped rescue cables and med pods. Commander Rawl's voice arrived with the dust. "Survivors," he said. The word trembled. "Signal received. We were delayed by poisonous weather and the war in the next sector. Hold." They held. They held like people who had learned the difference between waiting and wasting. When the cables lowered, Threx lifted Vanna and did not let her see his eyes. Auric carried Lessa as if she had gone asleep on the way to summer. The shuttle swallowed them. The plateau was empty. The debrief rooms were small. They always were. The walls carried the clean smell of disinfectant and the old smell of boiled water. Rawl listened. His mandibles clicked sometimes. Grief, Eli would have guessed if Eli had been there to guess. A grief Rawl hid like a knife inside an officer's tunic. "Eli Calder," Vanna said at last, and had to stop to swallow the way a person swallows when their throat has become a rope. "He did not die for us. He lived for us until he burned." "That is an important difference," Rawl said softly. "It is all the difference," Auric rasped. He flexed his hands as if they remembered the taste of the beacon's weight. He did not say his name. He didn't need to, Lessa whispered. "The planet will say it for him now. The canyon will whisper it. The mushrooms will hum it when the wind goes east." Threx stared at his fists. "I called him Soft World," he said. "We come from the desert. We harden our mouths with salt and wind. I thought he would break. He didn't. He rubbed off our edges and showed us where we were blades." Rawl signed their papers. He stared at the empty line where Eli's signature would have gone and clicked his mandibles once, then again. A sound like a prayer spoken by someone who does not remember the words but knows the shape of the silence. The Academy raised a plaque for Eli Calder at the end of a long corridor where sunlight laid out letters on the floor. It was small. It did not say hero. It said present. Children touched it when they passed. In winter, the metal got cold. The galaxy moved the way it always does. Sideways, stubborn, full of hunger and laughter. War shifted to the next sector. Trade lanes braided themselves around embargoes like vines around fences. The Deathworld program took 36 more teams to other places that wanted to kill them and taught them how to walk there anyway. Years passed and then a message arrived. It was not loud. It did not come on a beam that rattled nav boys. It arrived in the soft back channel that old beacons use when they are tired and alone and still reaching. The message hit a net of listening stones around a minor moon, bounced off a derrick where a woman with stainless steel teeth worked double shifts, threaded a signal relay half buried in a methane swamp, and reached the Academy at a polite hour between dinner and the time the young lie down and pretend to sleep. "This is Cadet Eli Calder," the voice said. It sounded like stone getting warm in winter sun. "Reporting survival. Vyre 3 is adapting, so am I. Rahl played it 3 times. He did not know how to hold relief that long. He sent the message to Vanna, to Lessa, to Auric, to Threx, to the entire list of the unslept and the unquiet. He signed the order to launch a retrieval. He said a word in his own language that meant the egg you thought had cracked was only hatching late. The ship they sent, the Mercy Street, was old, stubborn, and full of scars. Its captain was a woman from the freighter belts who had learned to drink her tea without letting it slosh in gravity shifts. She took one look at the storm maps Rahl sent and laughed once. In that way people laugh just before they show you how good they are at their work. "Hold my cup," she said, and went. They hit Vyre 3 at the margin of a season that wasn't listed in any book. The clouds were the color of iron filings. The wind blew as if trying to blow itself out. The Mercy Street came in sideways and righted herself and landed with a shrug. Lessa, who came along because the ship would not have forgiven them if she had not, leaned forward in her harness and smelled the air with her mouth. "He's here," she said, and the captain did not ask how she knew. They found him on the plateau that had become a field of new stone. He was thinner, the way a wire gets thin where it has been pulled hot, but he stood straight. He had grown a beard that looked like an apology for existing. His hair had been cut with a blade of glass. His suit was a palimpsest of other suits. His pack looked like a shrine to the idea that nothing is trash if it still has a job. He touched the ship with one hand the way a person touches a doorframe of a house they have not seen since the day they left home. He looked up. The sky was wrong the way a healed bone is wrong, stronger, stranger, full of stories. Vanna ran until she remembered the gravity, and then she still ran. She wrapped him in her arms, and he let himself be held without the awkward stiffness of a man who does not know what to do with kindness. Auric came behind and made a sound that could have been laughter or weather. Lessa kept 6 steps back and watched his feet because hunters know to check for limps before they ask about weather. Threx did not move. He watched, and then he went down on one knee and touched the ground the way he had seen desert men greet the earth after a long journey. He looked up and his eyes were shiny. "You taught me to be a wall," he said. Eli smiled small. "You taught me to be a spear when I needed to," he said, and they both looked away and breathed like men who had walked out of a story and were learning to stand still again. "How?" Rahl asked later, when he had Eli alone in a room that smelled like boiled water and clean fabric. "How did you live?" "I looked for work," Eli said simply. The planet had a lot that needed doing. He told him the blast had thrown him into a crevasse with a slope that slid like powdered glass. He fell. He found a pocket of heat. He lay there listening while his body took stock. He bound his wounds with lint and foil. He mapped the sound of the world and worked out where the air seeped and where the rocks sweated and found a way to climb. He traded his core heat for the planet's patience. He taught the glass serpents to fear a rhythm of taps on the stone, light, light, heavy, that meant pain. He learned where to put his hand on a mushroom to make it sing a note that frightened the Aranized birds who hunted by music. He made water by boiling the breath out of stones. He talked when he wanted to scream. He made a job for his hands every hour so his mind never had to become the kind of room you worry about entering. After a while, he said, the world kept score and decided I was interesting. That helps. We're good at being interesting when we have to be. Rahl nodded. There was a version of courage he understood better now. It was smaller and therefore harder. It had no soundtrack. It sounded like boiled water and steady breath. He bowed then in his insectile way, a crease along the abdomen that meant respect from his people the way a hand to the chest means I see you to humans. You will be asked to speak to classes, Rahl said. I will not insist. Heroes should get to choose what kind of work they do after. I am not a hero, Eli said. He looked at his hands. They were rough. The wire scar around his wrist was a pale rope now. I am a person who had to keep going. That's the job. He lifted his eyes. They were the calmest blue Rahl had ever seen. I will talk. I don't say much, but I'll say enough. The galaxy did what it does. It leaned in. It asked for pieces of him he never thought were valuable, the way he looked at a problem when he was hungry, the way he held a wrench like a pen and a pen like a plan. He gave what he could. He kept some pieces back. A person is not a quarry. You don't get to dig them out completely. When the next Deathworld cycle came, his name was on everyone's lips like a superstition and a promise. He taught the rookies a quiet thing, how to hear the difference between wind and intention, how to make a shelter that did not anger the ground, how to say thank you to water. He made them laugh sometimes. He made them think always. He taught Threx to listen with his tail, to read the ground, and the big Takara shook with the frustration of learning until he grinned in relief and said, "Soft world, you will ruin me," and then softened his footsteps until he could stalk an echo. They returned to Vyre 3 once more. They took a team of engineers to study the canyon the blast had carved and watch the planet breathe. They left offerings, not because they believed in trade with rock and wind, because it felt correct to practice gratitude where the world had, against its own nature, let a human slip through. The monster did not return, or it did, but differently. Sometimes the stone bulged as if remembering teeth. Sometimes the wind went low and long and made the mushrooms go still. Eli would look east and his mouth would thin and he would say, "We gave it a story. That changes things." He walked with Vanna in the half-light and let her talk about loneliness and the way medics borrow pain to practice empathy and how sometimes they forget to set it back down. He flew with Auric in the simulation dome and let the enormous avian teach him joy like a first song. He ran the canyon with Lessa and learned to move the way she did, foot, breath, stillness, until he could find his way back in fog by the taste of the air alone. He argued softly with Threx about what it meant to be a soldier. They agreed on this. You do not go somewhere to win. You go to still the chaos long enough for those willing to build to arrive. On the anniversary of Joro's light, they set a small tower on the plateau. It held nothing but a battery and a red lens. It pulsed once each dawn. Eli said he would have liked a signal that didn't ask for anything, and the tower did exactly that. It said, "I am," and that was all. There were more wars because some species find conflict the way some planets find hot vents. There were treaties too because others get tired and decide to try listening. No one could do anything about the long appetite of the void, but they could tilt the table some days towards survival. Eli sat at those tables sometimes, not because he enjoyed politics, but because he understood scaffolding and how you brace a frame so the wind does not collapse it before the cement sets. He kept his field notebook. He wrote in it the way a farmer reads weather in a sky. He wrote small. He wrote as if words should fit into a pocket and still leave room for a key or a piece of candy for a child you might meet on a stairwell. He took one student aside each year and taught them how to boil water properly. It became a joke. It was not a joke. He told them to listen for the sound it makes just before it boils. That's the edge, he said. The place just before the change. Most of your life is going to happen there. Learn that sound. When he slept, he dreamed of the canyon. In the dreams, he walked down into it with a lamp and a bowl and set the bowl on the ground and waited. Sometimes the wind put a small stone in the bowl. He woke up happy those days. Once, years after the blast, he took a tram out of the city and walked to the ocean. The seawall still stood. Children still dared each other to jump. He watched the waves pick up threads of light and throw them back. He took his shoes off and put his feet in the water and let the cold climb his bones with a clean, sincere hunger. A boy stood beside him quietly. They shared silence the way two people share a bench at a bus stop before dawn. "You're him," the boy said at last. Eli did not answer a question he had never wanted to hear. "My aunt says you make things better," the boy said. He said it like a fact read off the side of a machine, not like a prayer. "I try," Eli said. "Why?" Eli thought of the canyon. He thought of Joro's last look and Vanna's hands and Lessa's ears laid flat and Oric's careful fingers and Threx's pride softening like clay under rain. He thought of boiled water and scaffolding and winter radiators that thumped arrhythmically like anxious hearts. "Because someone did that for me," he said. "Once, long before." The boy nodded, satisfied. "Good answer," he said, and went to jump off the seawall while his friends yelled until he laughed. Eli stayed until the sky turned the color of a bruise healing. He went home. He stopped by the corridor where the plaque hung and touched the metal. It was warm from the day. He could have been louder. He could have been carved bigger. He preferred his life like he preferred his tea, steady heat, no slosh. And yet, when storms came, and they always did, people called him. He showed up. He stood between. He listened until the problem betrayed its shape, and then he lifted the weight with both hands and a little grunt and said, "There." And the world, surprised, did not fall this time. On a night neither special nor famous, a Deathworld team keyed a channel during a lightning storm. Static bellowed. Then a voice, low and level and human, caught in the mesh and carried across space. A gift sent without a ribbon to whoever had built themselves enough to receive it. "This is Instructor Eli Calder," the voice said. "If you can hear me, breathe. If you can't hear me, breathe anyway. Put your hand where the ground is warm. Don't demand, ask. Don't shout, listen. Eat what you can, share the rest. When you think you are at the end, you are probably at the edge. Learn its sound. I'll hold the line." Then the channel cleared like winter sky after a storm. Headphone if you're enjoying this story. Take a second to like and subscribe. It really helps keep humanity's stories alive among the stars. The years wore him down the way water wears stone. They smoothed him. They did not make him small. He was not a general. He was not a poet. He was the sound right before the boil, the quiet in the room right before someone says we could try this. When the last big war in that century woke, the one with the machine minds from the back vents of the Perseus arm, everyone forgot how to breathe for a little while. The machines did not hate. They did not love. They reorganized. They were tidy like grief. They cut across maps like spilled salt. Their first wave made a hole in the alliance you could have flown a moon through. The Mercy Street went back into service. The captain still drank tea like a dare. Vanna ran med on the forward deck. Oric managed the ground teams with hands like bridges. Lessa took scouts so far behind the machine lines that their own maps shook their heads and gave up. Threx knocked holes in things. Eli stayed in the places where everything had become the sound you hear before something breaks. He drew paths through ruins for refugees with a grease pencil on a piece of plastic, and then went back and cleared the rubble himself, one chunk at a time. He showed a village on Kithar V how to detune their rooftops to make the targeting whine in the machine's ears into a note that felt like sand in joints. He put insulation in a hospital and watched the mortality charts drop like rain off a good roof. He taught a child how to hold a wrench. She taught him a swear in her language that tasted like honey and smoke. He carried Joro with him always. In the small toolbox on his hip, a lens. In his pocket, a coin of memory metal that warmed when he was near a strong electromagnetic field. He would take it out sometimes and let it shape itself to his palm and then go toward the heat that called it. He went a Vyre 3 once more, during a lull when lull meant 3 days of weather that only knocked you down 3 times a day instead of 4. He stood on the plateau that was now a plain. He set the coin on the ground and watched it tremble. He said nothing. The wind answered. "Still here," he said. The red lens tower pulsed once then again. It did not ask for help. It did not offer any. It declared. He smiled. He left a tin cup under it with 3 marbles inside because that seemed correct somehow. The machines learned too the way predators learn. They learned not to throttle their advances where he had taught walls how to stand up. They learned to go quiet and slide under the surface. He listened, and then he went quieter and slid under them. He began to wear noise the way a hunter wears a pelt, as needed. He kept the inside of himself spare. Then the moment came, the one that will make some see you and others pretend they do not. A machine swarm, bored and effective, found the families sleeping under the skeleton of a dome on Orvax Prime. Vanna had triage the size of a city. Auric had 20,000 bodies to move and 12,000 seats. Lessa could smell the engines heating 5 valleys away. Threx had orders to hit a factory that would choke the swarm 2 hours out if he survived the drop. Eli had a hole in the wall and a pencil and a single hour. He measured the hole with his eyes and palms. He listened to the whine in the machine's forelimbs, the one they make when they ramp up to the pitch that unthreads bone. He remembered the mushrooms and the note that turned birds. He took a string from a child's toy and strung it across the mouth of the corridor and wrapped it around an old heater and leaned a sheet of foil against a pipe and stepped back. The wind in the tunnel sang a note. It tasted like tin. He tuned it with a push, with a breath, with a thumb on a bolt. The sound changed, went lower, went into a place in his chest. He thought of his basement. He nodded once. Lesser raised an eyebrow. He shook his head. She trusted him. The machines came. They heard the note and adjusted to it and tried to sing back. They sang in the same place. They caught their own echo, and it dirtied their targeting algorithms the way humidity wrecks a hairdo. They stumbled. Auric moved families. Vanna hauled bodies not yet gone towards safety. Threx hid his factory and crawled out of the crater on hands and knees and laughed until he cried. Eli sat in the mouth of the corridor and touched the string and kept it true while the world learned a lesson about feedback. When it was done, he did not stand. He took 3 breaths that tasted like the bottom of a kettle. Then he stood and said, "I want soup," and everyone laughed the way you laugh when you just remembered you have a throat. The war turned on a hinge. It did not end quickly. It never does. But the machines withdrew in weather like shame and sent smaller, quieter hurts. The Alliance learned walls and springs and songs. It learned to say "I am" even when it could not say "I will win." That was enough some days. Some days enough is a miracle. At the end, because even long wars have to end if anyone's going to build, they signed a thing on a table in a room with ugly carpet. The machines sent a lens that turned color when you touched it. Auric wanted to break it on principle. Vanna said, "Let's not make new ghosts today." Lessa stole it later and hung it in a window. The light through it in the morning made a stripe on Eli's kitchen wall. He stood in it sometimes with his coffee and let it climb his face. He looked younger in that light. He looked like a boy on a seawall measuring a jump with his toes. The Academy's hall grew new plaques. Some big, some small. They added a line to Eli's instructor. A child added another below that with a sticker that said "Fixer" in glitter. No one removed it. Even Raul, who hated glitter the way engineers hate sand, left it. Time took his grandmother. He took the field notebook to the funeral and read from it. A list of repairs done on bad days. A list of foods you could make with not enough money. A list of things a body can survive that you don't think it can until it does. People came to him afterward and put their hands on his shoulders and said, that was the right kind of saying. He fell in love. He did it quietly and then all at once, and then not quietly at all when the person he loved, a surveyor with shoulders like promises, laughed and took his hand in a market and didn't let go. They bought a pot too big for their stove. They boiled water and listened. The moment just before the boil felt like a doorway opening somewhere else in the apartment. They stood in it together and smiled into a future that would have its own wars, its own winter radiators, its own plates left in the sink for too long, and its own amends made with tea and hands. He taught the class one more time, the one for the quiet ones, the ones in the back with notebooks, the ones who would learn how to be walls without forgetting how to be doors. He told them the story of the canyon and the ghost machine and the wire rain, and the way a rescue beacon can be coaxed like a stubborn heart. He told them a thing he had never said out loud in a room larger than his kitchen. I was not brave first, he said. I was tired first, I was hungry first, I was shamed first. I learned to stand because sitting hurt. Then I learned to stand for others. Courage is what happens when stubbornness falls in love. They did not clap. It wasn't that kind of class. They breathed, and he could hear some of them learning the edge. When he died, because you do, he did it the way he had lived, with work unfinished that someone else would finish happily. He had a wrench in his hand. The radiator in the old hall had gone funny again in winter, thumping like the sea under ice, and he had smiled and said, "You and me," and then stopped mid-turn and leaned his head against the wall and let a long breath go like a tide running out. They put him under glass, which was a kindness. They put his name in stone, which was an argument, and he would have laughed but accepted it. They told his stories to each other until they wore them comfortable in the mouth and could say them without crying. Children stood in the corridor and read the plaque and the glitter sticker and then ran their fingers over the letters, and the stone warmed under their hands. The wind blew. The domes hummed. The water boiled with the sound he had taught them to listen for. They took his field notebook and made a copy and passed it around. It had soup recipes. It had instructions for detuning roofs. It had a note that said simply, "If found, read and add one thing that helped you live." People did. The book got heavier. The academy made a library around it and called the room a kitchen because that's where we keep our best tools for staying. Sometimes late, when the domes went quiet and the stars laid their whetted knives along the city's curve, a whisper would lift from the stones like steam. A name, but only as a rumor, because you don't say the names of people likely too often in case you start believing they are rare. They are not. They are stubborn. They are listening. They are everywhere. And when the galaxy looked at that corridor, at that kitchen, at that plateau far away where a little red light still pulsed once most mornings for no reason except to say "I am," it exhaled. It remembered. And that day the galaxy learned humanity doesn't conquer, it endures. Headphone, thank you for listening. Until next time, stay human, stay unbroken.